hospice care, and he never ever wanted to be alive, kept alive on a machine. So by the time I got to Baltimore, all these thoughts came rushing out. I knew, despite our optimism, that my dad probably would not survive the stroke and heart attack, and I kind of figured he would not leave the hospital alive. When I got there, he was paralyzed on one side of his body. He had lost all capacity to speak. And the only way we knew he was still with us were his blinking eyes and sometimes the squeeze of the hand. Unfortunately, the doctors told us several times these were just tiny flickers of recognition that were more like reflexes, not really a sign of communication, but of course we didn't believe that. If anyone could communicate with us, it was my tough dad, who always wanted to talk and dispense advice and share stories of his life with us. But eventually both methods of communication, his flickering eyes and his squeezy hands, failed as the doctors predicted. This amazing man, who had been married to my mom for 52 years, who had 4 happily married children, and all of us are still married today. My husband and I just celebrated our 40th anniversary, and my youngest sibling celebrated her 33rd anniversary. He had 10 wonderful grandchildren. He had been a rock to all of us, and now, for the first time in his life, he was losing control. We all kept vigil overnight Wednesday and Thursday. We made sure all the grandchildren had individual time with my dad. By Friday morning, his body system started to shut down, and that respirator that was keeping him going was still in my dad's throat and making him really uncomfortable. So the hard part was next. The doctors called my brother and I and my 2 sisters and my mom to a small room and said, well, what are you going to do? He's never going to recover. His brain was swelling and it was causing more problems. And at this point, a faith perspective jumps in. For most Catholics, the belief is God is the only one that has the right to take a life. So we were deciding here, what do we do? Do we take the respirator away? Do you let my dad pass on his own? My dad didn't want hospice. How do you do that? Well, as we were in the room, I had a quick thought. We need somebody from the younger generation here. So I took my 23-year-old daughter, Suzanne, and I made her come in with us, wondering if that was going to help because the next generation should be there to witness what this was like so they could be the support for anyone else who had to go through this. In my heart, I knew that one of those grandchildren needed a window into the future and needed to be able to assure the other grandchildren that things were going to be fine. Suzanne was really close to my dad. She was the obvious choice. Well, with no hope and knowing my dad's wishes to die with dignity, we decided to let him go and remove the respirator. After the respirator was removed, we gathered as children of my parents with our spouses to say goodbye and to pray. And I know Mr. Durstein, who has spoken before about being there when someone that you loved in your family passed away, and that went through my mind right away, that it really helped you. So I had my hand on my dad's forehead, my siblings had their hands on his arms, and my mom held his hand tight. These were probably the most powerful faith moments I have ever had. God was present, and we felt privileged to be with my dad in his last hours. We also believe a miracle of communication occurred when at one point my dad raised his left hand, the one that still had movement, and waved at us like this, kind of like waving goodbye. It was like a sign from him that said, it's okay, I'm ready to go. And he had suffered for 8 years with eating and with getting weaker and weaker and weaker. So all of us were there, 12 of us, as he breathed his last breath after 2 hours of a vigil with him. To this day, all of us felt that being with my dad in those last 2 days was a gift because we had time to process his passing and we had time to let God be with us and give strength for the next stage of grieving, which, as many of you know, is very, very difficult. If you've ever lost a parent, a grandparent, a child, or a sibling, you know that the viewing, which in a Catholic tradition is usually for 2 days, the Mass, which is the day of the burial, and other faith perspectives, a church service or a memorial service, is very difficult. Basically, reprocessing everything that happened as someone has died. Before my mom, shock took over. My husband and I took care of her, and she shared with us later that she barely remembers even the day that my dad died, because of the situation that she was in. We had over 450 people visit the funeral home in those 2 days, and people came from near and far to offer their condolences. Dozens of Dad's former young athletes, now in their 40s and 50s, shared memories of his coaching and remembered words of wisdom that Mr. Chuck had given them. To this day, my mom still keeps in touch with about 12 of those former players. All of us are in our 60s now. So my dad did have a big impact on everyone. The big conversation that night was who was balding, who was going gray, because we hadn't seen each other probably since the days that my dad coached. Many of my dear friends came from New Jersey and New York and Christopher Dock. And it meant so much to me and to all of us. It was very clear that my dad impacted many lives, and the support of those visitors really, really eased our heart. In order to gather some control for myself, I volunteered to write and deliver the eulogy and plan the Mass. At least it made me feel in charge again. It helped me to see God's hand in the process of dying and gave me hope that death was just a beginning and that finally my dad was at peace and he was not suffering physically. You know, we never got mad at Dad for leaving us or for God at taking him. But for someone who had always been a giver in his life, it was hard for us to imagine how the world would be without him. And my world changed. These words were spoken by Miss Johnston when she talked in the spring of 2003 about losing her mom to cancer. These words never left me because I knew one day I was going to face the death of my parents, people who were such an integral part of my life. Miss Johnson's courage in talking about her mom's death actually gave me courage to talk about my dad's passing for the first time here in chapel in 2005. So what can you take away from my story? Well, first is, never lose faith in God, for God will sustain you in grief. I'm really not sure how people deal with death and grief if they don't have a faith perspective. Second, as trite as it may seem, I had to say there has to be a reason for my dad dying, and it's God's plan. After my dad died, we actually had some family relationships that were healed, so that was a blessing. And I also like to believe that the grandchildren, who at that time were 26 to 13, got to see what Christian faith in action looks like. Most of you know that faith is not just attending church. It's so much more than that. Third, if possible, visit the funeral home when someone close to you or a friend of yours has died. Nobody knows what to say. Just your presence is comforting. To have all those people come back and give us support made our grieving process easier. Consider sending a note about a week after the funeral. That's a really tough time because reality is kicking in, the casseroles have stopped coming, and you start to become lonely. And loneliness is potent, and it's sad. In a few weeks after someone dies, consider sending a card or a letter in the mail that says, "How are you?" As you can tell, my dad was one who I admired greatly and loved tremendously. His influence and love of sports made me want to be a physical education teacher and coach, which I did for 22 years before I came to Christopher Dock. He pushed me to succeed in life and to stretch myself in all areas. One of his mottos was, never settle for anything less than your best. When I scored 22 points in a basketball game in high school or college, he would never say, "Good job, Joan." I would get this little nod after a game, always with a little scowl, and he would say, "You owe me 15 cents. I'm like, "Dad, what's up with that? You missed 3 layups, a nickel apiece." And then he and I would laugh, and the next day we'd be back in the back alley practicing layups or tap shots. Some weeks I didn't get the amount of rebounds that he wanted, but none of that ever put me down. I knew that my dad was pushing me to strive for excellence and not giving me an easy way out. It was never a mean toughness. It was a message that you must always be the best that you can be. And his motto was shortened when the grandchildren were little, was "can do." And to this day, the grandchildren that are married have "can do" on their refrigerator, which is really cool. I think my dad made me the person who to this day pushes my own students to reach their potential. And I know some of my students think I'm a nag, and I know some of my students think that I'm constantly pushing. But I believe that you can be more than you are at this particular moment. No one has said something this year to me about this, but my dad's initials are always on my whiteboard all year round in my classroom to remind me of his presence and his impact on my life. So where's the observance kids in my classroom? Somebody had just asked, what does CHS mean? Well, the greatest tangible gift my dad ever gave me was a circular silver charm that he presented to me at my high school graduation. And this is my high school charm bracelet. This is before Pandora and all these other things came out. It simply said, "You're a proud dad." And on the back, it had my high school graduation. Yes, my dad's life changed my world, and his death changed everything. But I'm a better person than he gave me. My dad's legacy lives on in his 10 grandchildren. 6 of those grandchildren played sports in college, which I think is amazing to think about. He has 5 great-grandbabies, 2 more on the way, and every one of them is ready to kick soccer balls, shoot hoops, and perhaps swim or play lacrosse. My mom is still with us at 85 years of age, living in the same house that we grew up in, still sharp as a tack, and still leading our family with love and the modeling of what great parenting is like. My wish for all of you is that you could have a relationship with your parents or your guardians or even some adults or mentors in your life like I did with my parents. And finally, my world did change when my dad passed away, but his impact on me and his family will never